Conference rankings right here at the Voice of College Football. Appreciate you stopping by for the best in discussion, debate, and analysis. We have played 3 weeks, and we are entering week 4 and finally have arrived at a place where we have enough results where we feel comfortable we can rank these conferences. They've all played over 40 non-conference games and all have played between 10 and 15 games between each other in the Power 4. So let's check out the numbers. But more importantly, put these numbers and these results, seeding the teams, putting them into context. Let's start with the ACC. Week 3 in the ACC included 8 wins in 12 games non-conference, but only 1 win in the Power 4 as Pitt came back down by 10 in the final few minutes to upend West Virginia. Other decent wins, there weren't many. Miami dominated Ball State and Duke outlasted UConn. Other than that, a lot of insignificant wins. North Carolina State was almost upset by Louisiana Tech, but they came back with a second half flurry in that one. Losses for the ACC. BC put up a fight against Mizzou, but they lost 27-21. Virginia was leading Maryland in the second half, but blew that game 27-13. Of course, Florida State's demise continues as they go to 0-3. Memphis won it 20-12. And Wake Forest blown out by Ole Miss as expected. 21-point spread, though, was surpassed as Ole Miss won it 40-6. Again, 8-4 for the ACC, but they lost most of the Power 5 games. Pitt saved the week for the ACC. So now if we go to the overall standings through 3 weeks, we've got the ACC with a 31-9 record. They're 6-8 against the Power 4. The Pitt win against West Virginia is also supplemented by Cal with a big win on the Plains against Auburn. Duke beat Northwestern in overtime. Of course, Miami dominated Florida. North Carolina with a last-second field goal win against Minnesota. And then Pitt's got another win against Cincinnati, 28-27. Power 4 losses including SMU, new to the ACC, losing against BYU as a double-digit favorite. Clemson, of course, blasted by Georgia by 31. NC State blasted by Tennessee 51-10. TCU beat Stanford. Vandy beat Virginia Tech. The Hokies were a 13-point favorite in that game. We talked about Missouri over BC and Maryland over Virginia. Also the Ole Miss win over Wake. Coming up in week 4, there are 3 Power 4 matchups as Rutgers goes to Blacksburg to take on the Hokies, and Rutgers won this matchup in Piscataway last year by 19 points. You also have TCU and SMU. They get together almost every year. TCU won the game against SMU last season. They visit Dallas-Fort Worth on Saturday. We've got Michigan State and BC hooking up with the Big Ten and the ACC, getting together there. Other possible challenges for the ACC include James Madison going to Chapel Hill and Duke taking on Middle Tennessee State, Miami going to Tampa to take on USF, who of course played a good 3-quarter game against Bama. The Big 12 was projected by most of us as the most competitive conference, the most balanced in all of college football in the Power 4 level, as Utah seemed to be the elite of the conference, supplemented by Oklahoma State and Kansas State in particular, possibly Iowa State, Houston, Cincinnati at the bottom, but generally on any given Saturday, a lot of toss-up games in the Big 12. Now, we have yet to see much conference play, but let's look at the non-conference performance out of the Big 12. In week 3, the conference went 9-2. The 2 losses, Pitt beat West Virginia. The Mountaineers had a 10-point lead with just a few minutes left in that game. Kansas lost as an 8-point favorite against UNLV as UNLV has notched its second win against the Big 12. Of course, they defeated Houston. This win over the Jayhawks 23-20. So overall against the Power 4, the Big 12 is 5-7, 32-9 overall out of conference against a group of 5 in the FCS included. Look at the Power 4 wins. Arizona State beat Mississippi State by a touchdown. BYU, 3 better than SMU. Iowa State with a big win, probably the biggest outside the conference this season, defeating in-state rival Iowa at the gun with a 54-yard field goal. Oklahoma State was outplayed by Arkansas for much of the game, but they came back and won in overtime. TCU over one of the worst teams in college football, Stanford. The losses for the Big 12. Pitt with a doubleheader win over Cincinnati and West Virginia in back-to-back weeks. Of course, Colorado was bludgeoned by Nebraska. Kansas upset at Illinois. We've got the Texas Tech loss against Washington State. Texas Tech was a slight favorite in that game. They lost by 3 touchdowns. West Virginia was no contest with Penn State. And then we've got, of course, Oklahoma, Houston, as the Cougars put up a fight before losing 16-12 on the road in Norman. Now going forward, most of the Big 12 games are going to be in conference. So in week 4, we only have 2 non-conference tilts. We've got Arkansas State, who gave Michigan some fits, played relatively close at 28-18. They're going to Iowa State. And TCU again takes on SMU. With the additions of Oregon, Washington, USC, and UCLA, the Big Ten was supposed to be challenging the SEC as the preeminent conference in college football. Let's see how the Big Ten is faring at this point in non-conference play. 36-7 overall. That includes everyone. 6-7, though, against the Power 4. Let's look at the results, starting with week 3. Oregon finally got it cranked up. They demolished Oregon State by 5 touchdowns. Maryland won its game against Virginia by 2 touchdowns on the road. Those are the pluses. The minuses in a 9-3 week, 2-3 against the other power conferences. Notre Dame just completely annihilated Purdue, 66-7. Washington, they were a 5-point favorite against Washington State. They lost by 5 in Seattle. And, of course, the big showdown in Camp Randall Stadium for big noon kickoff. Bama way too much for Wisconsin, 42-10. So let's put it all together through 3 weeks. There we've got the results. The best wins for the Big Ten. Penn State dominating West Virginia. Nebraska blew out Colorado. Illinois with a big win against Kansas. That looks good. As does, of course, USC and LSU. That's probably the best team the Big Ten has defeated this year, as USC won in the final 8 seconds of that game. And again, we've got Maryland over Virginia. Those are the 6 wins for the Big Ten against the other conferences. The losses: Iowa loses at the gun. Michigan killed by Texas 31-12. Minnesota loses at the gun. Northwestern loses to Duke. They lost a lead late, then they lost in overtime. We talked about Bama, Wisconsin, Notre Dame, Purdue, Washington State. In fact, going into last weekend, the Big Ten was 4-4 against the Power 4, but they lost 3 of those 4 games on the last play of the game. Could have been 7-1. A lot of close calls out there for the Big Ten in losing to the likes of Duke and Iowa State and North Carolina, but also some close calls on the positive side for the Big Ten as Michigan State escaped Florida Atlantic. Oregon escaped twice against Idaho as they were leading the Vandals just by 3 points in the fourth quarter and beat Boise State at the gun. Penn State got a scare from Bowling Green. Wisconsin a scare from Western Michigan. UCLA only beat Hawaii by 3. And Northwestern barely escaped Miami of Ohio. Coming up in week 4 for the Big Ten, we've got Marshall at Ohio State, Charlotte at Indiana, Villanova at Maryland, Kent State at Penn State. We see little of consequence there. But here we go. You've got Purdue at Oregon State. The Boilers have to bounce back after that complete embarrassment, humiliation against the Irish. Oregon State coming off a big loss as well. Michigan State at BC has become an interesting game here as BC has proven to be a capable team, and Michigan State better than we thought. Now with a win on its record against Maryland, UCLA would appear to be overmatched at LSU. And then you've got the Rutgers-Virginia Tech game where the Scarlet Knights won this matchup at home by 19 points. Now they've got to go to Lane Stadium. So big weekend for the Big Ten with 4 non-conference Power 4 matchups in week 4. We know the old tired line. It just means more in the SEC. Well, what has meant more is that the SEC has been the best conference with the best results in every possible fashion for the past 15 or 20 years. Is this holding up, though, in 2024? Non-conference. Let's take a look. For the SEC, you've got a 32-8 record. That includes the FCS and the Group of 5. Against the Power 4, the SEC at 8-6, coming off a nice week at 8-2 with 3 consecutive wins against the Power 4 conferences, as Mizzou beat BC, Bama killed Wisconsin by 32, Ole Miss over Wake Forest. Let's also include, not as a power conference win, but as a quality win, Oklahoma beat Tulane. When we add it all up, the SEC has defeated some pretty good teams. Clemson, Wisconsin, Boston College, also NC State, and Michigan, and Virginia Tech. The losses for the SEC against the Power Four include an Arkansas team that's probably one of the worst in the SEC, taking Oklahoma State, who should contend for a Big 12 championship, to overtime. The worst loss on the board, you got to say, for the SEC out of conference is this Auburn loss at home against Cal. Florida was not competitive with Miami. Of course, USC, LSU went down to the wire. Mississippi State not competitive with Arizona State. And now Mississippi State, of course, lost this game against Toledo over the weekend. And that was part of two losses for the SEC this past weekend against a group of five, as Vanderbilt also lost to Georgia State. And then again, USC and LSU went down to the final play, and that's a loss for the SEC. Coming up in week 4, we've got Kentucky at home against Ohio. And we have other group of 5 matchups against Bowling Green, Akron, Georgia Southern, and Louisiana Monroe. The one Power 4 matchup is UCLA at LSU. Of course, LSU went out to Pasadena as a favorite in 2021 and lost that game to UCLA at the Rose Bowl. We have focused on matchups between the Power 4 conferences. Here is a statistic of note. The Power 4 against a group of 5 in FCS this season, just 28-4 this past weekend. And I say just 28-4 because prior to week 3, the record was 78-1. So add it all up, it's 106 wins for the Power 4, 5 for the group of 5 and FCS. All of those games won by the group of 5. Now let's get to our rankings with this week 4 ahead. Rutgers at Virginia Tech, UCLA at LSU, TCU at SMU, Purdue at Oregon State, and Michigan State at BC. You would think Virginia Tech's got about a 60 or 70% chance of winning that game at home at Lane Stadium. LSU's probably an 85% pick against UCLA. TCU, SMU, toss up. Purdue at Oregon State, got to lean with the Beavers on that one by about 65 to 70%. Michigan State, Boston College is a sneaky, under-the-radar, really good matchup. When you throw it all together, and we've got the records displayed right there, and the records tell us little because the non-conference record for these conferences is almost identical. Now, the SEC has somewhat separated itself with a 3-0 week 3, and now the SEC is the only conference above 500 at 8-6. So we've got the SEC at number 1, the Big Ten at number 2, the ACC at 3. Thank you, Pitt. Otherwise, it would be the Big 12 at number 3 because Pitt won those 2 matchups against Cincinnati and West Virginia. And kudos to the Pac-12. They are really the big winner of the week because they are maintaining their conference by bringing in 4 teams from the Mountain West Conference. So we once again will have a Power 5, it appears to be. Please like, comment, subscribe right here at the Voice of College Football. Keep it locked in. We're going to go through every conference and deliver our power rankings coming up soon right here at the Voice of College Football.